Right, welcome back. So now we're going to start our next panel, building self-sovereign infrastructure and World War III resilient societies. So from the left, we have Zach, Ameen, Adrian, Ryan, Ian, and moderating the panel, we have Michelle. So big round of applause, please, for them.
Testing. Thank you all for staying. This is the last panel of the day. All the homework has been done, maybe by other people, not you. This is just the fun panel. So I hope you enjoy it. I was really happy to be allocated this panel because ever since I was a teenager, for some reason, I've been really obsessed about World War II. And so this is a great panel for me. I would like each of the panelists to introduce yourself really briefly, and then we'll get into the fun.
Okay. Yeah, so my name's Ian Miers. I've been working in ZK Snarks and blockchain since before you've heard of ZK Snarks, co-inventor of Zcash, professor at the University of Maryland, and now the lead research scientist at Aleo, which is a privacy-preserving smart contract platform.
Ryan Lackey. I've been at Cypherpunk since the early 1990s, did an offshore data haven in the North Sea, bunch of defense contracting stuff in war zones, started a crypto privacy company using SGX, and then now I work for a crypto insurance company. So.
I'm Adrian. This is my interest going to be a lot less exciting. I work in self-sovereign infrastructure with Anoma.
Hello, I'm Ameen Soleimani. This says privacy pools. That's one of the things we do. It's a new privacy protocol that allows you to have potentially compliance by proving that you're not the terrorists, criminals, hackers, etc. that potentially use it. And yeah, builds on some of the research Ian did back in the day.
Hey there, I'm Zach. So I'm the CEO of Aztec. We are apparently we're World War III infrastructure, but we're also a privacy preserving layer 2 for Ethereum. Effectively, we're recreating Ethereum-style smart contract ecosystems, but one where you have private state as a first-class primitive. So you can protect user privacy, you can create private identities, private balances, private finance, private whatever you want. Making Web3 private.
Awesome, thank you all. So there are two keywords in the title. One is self-sovereign infrastructure, and one is World War III. I'm going to ignore for now self-sovereign because it's a term that, maybe people outside of tinfoil hat communities don't fully understand or agree on the definition. So we're just going to focus on something everybody will understand, which is World War III, to some extent. Okay, so world building. What does World War III look like? So World War III means global war, not civil war. So there's going to be a lot of surveillance, a lot of neighbor spying, and this is literally the book 1984. It's going to be super illegal to run end-to-end encrypted communications, and there'll also be martial law, and this is, again, to quote from another piece of literary fiction, The Handmaid's Tale. Social trust has been largely eroded. And maybe at some point it'll be a bloody war, but it certainly will more likely start with a remote war. So sabotage of infrastructure systems, cyber attacks, drones and robots, maybe some balloons. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just going to start with disagreeing.
Oh.
I think World War III is not going to look like necessarily mass surveillance. I think it's going to be the breakdown of social coordination at large scales, mostly because fiber and satellites will most likely go away sort of on the onset. And it's going to be much more on like, can you actually run local communities, and like, can local communities coordinate effectively, right? Like, we shouldn't assume like there's a global one world government in World War III that then surveils everyone. And this actually seems very unlikely. It just seems that Facebook just goes away, and like most tools for global surveillance will go away because like the internet, as we think of it nowadays, which is like 3 servers in Virginia, will mostly disappear, and all of a sudden we'll be like down to home data centers and like actually like local connectivity.
home data centers.
I'll start with an even spicier take of, you like World War II, let's use the World
I
War
don't
II
like
analogy.
it, just
Okay.
make
But you like studying World War II.
Yeah.
When did World War II start? That is not a clear question. It is not clearly defined. There's an argument that World War III has already started.
Yeah.
And also, during World War II, there were parts of the world that were actually pretty chill. Like, there were countries that were neutral, there were countries that were combatants, but it was actually pretty, honestly, living in the home front in the US during World War II was pretty decent. Living in the home front in Japan or Russia was very, very bad. So it depends on where you were, and I don't think there's any reason why World War III will be a universal government global horror for everybody at the same level all the time. So we're much more likely to have a world where things are different, and arguably that's already started.
Right, and I think to echo your point of when did World War II start, so if you sit in like the US, I'm a professor and live in the University in Washington, DC, the term that people say around there is great power competition. So it's before you get to actual war, you have different countries going after each other. And as much as this may be alien to this audience, and I should point out that like I've done the completely rogue Zcash style stuff, it is useful to be able to talk to governments in the language of, look, now you have to worry about other governments doing things to you. You know that whole surveillance state you built that you thought it was no one but us? Well, guess what? Now it works against you. And so it's a very useful narrative to explaining why you want these techniques so that we have them out and working in the event that you actually end up with.
This is why you want privacy.
Stuff.
Privacy for national defense. Like this should be the biggest pitch on like why privacy matters. It's privacy for national defense in a power competition.
All
So
right,
it's really
we'll do the
sovereignty more than anything else.
We'll do the privacy shilling later. Okay, so now that we've talked about world building, let's talk about like what does World War III resilient tech mean? I'm going to start with my quick definition and then ask for input. So my quick definition is you yourself cannot be singled out for attack or retribution because you can do three things privately: communicate, organize, and transact. So that's exchanging things or store value. Please add.
I mean, I would agree with that definition. It's rather severe in that, I mean, that's generally how I aim to build privacy-preserving transaction protocols today, hopefully without assuming we're still in a time of peace. But those are the fundamental, like, what makes us human is who are you, what have you done, what do you want to do, and what do you own? I think those are basically the four, like, if you understand those four ingredients of somebody, you've got a pretty good idea on their character and who they are. And so, yeah, like the whole who are you, identity, being able to coordinate with other people, selectively reveal who you are without broadcasting that to the world. And what do you want to do? That's all about governance, coordination, being able to do that privately. And then when it comes to ownership and like the things you want to achieve, a lot of that can be defined through the lens of transacting with value-carrying assets. So yeah, a lot of words to say, yeah, I agree.
Cool.
I think there's like 2, maybe 3 interesting stories from World War II that could help set the stage for this conversation. One is about how the Netherlands had really great KYC. And the Nazis were thrilled to discover this when they took over the Netherlands, because then they were able to hunt down and arrest all the Jews very quickly and efficiently as a result of their great KYC system that they never thought would be abused or fall into the wrong
What
hands.
is this KYC system? Can you say more?
KYC is Know Your Customer. They had ledgers of addresses
They just had big databases.
Yeah, and religious affiliation in there as well. And so that allowed the Nazis to and the Netherlands actually had the worst rate of Jewish atrocities in World War II, I think, as any of the countries that Germany took over. So the lesson there is design your systems to be resilient against not only external actors, but even potentially yourself, because you don't know if you're going to be the good guy defending it in the future. And the other thing is where cryptography came from. In my view, the MVP, most valuable player of World War II, is Alan Turing, who cracked the Nazi encryption by outcomputing them by inventing a computer. gay man in England, just put the whole team on his back. And what the Allies had to do in order to preserve the information from the Nazis that they did in fact have the ability to break their codes was let their own ships sink. So that the Nazis wouldn't figure out that they had cracked these codes. And then that's what allowed them to like see what the Nazis were saying about D-Day and then eventually have, coordinate D-Day and then win the war in World War II. And that's what led to cryptography itself being labeled as a munition in America, which led to, really silly outcomes down the road once people got personal computers and started playing around with cryptography. Is you have like a computer science professor teaching a class about algorithms, and one of the algorithms is an encryption algorithm, and he has a foreign exchange student in his class, and then he gets arrested for exporting munitions. And then this is sort of what started the crypto wars of the 70s, 80s, round one, for allowing personal encryption to be legal.
So like having the tech
first
is also
example-
dangerous.
On the first example, so Switzerland historically did the right thing. They did not have gun registers because for kind of similar reasons. But if your entire defense is based on a militia system with everyone owning guns, it's a bad idea if there's a central place where you can find all the guns, right? Sadly, the EU forced them into at least putting in a pro forma gun register now to be sort of compliant with the highest gun ownership rate in.
Wait. You just hit my one pet peeve for all of this because you segued from cryptography and the crypto wars to Switzerland.
No.
Does everyone know what crypto AG was? You should Google it just because that's hilarious. Not germane, but keep going.
Yeah. No, that was it.
Okay.
On like why you shouldn't keep central registers, and like some countries tend to think about these problems more so than the Dutch apparently.
Well, I remember last year I gave a talk, and part of it was about how we got really excited about like big filing systems. It was the technology that would like rule the world and commerce. So I think like we're at that path-dependent point where now we have technology to help us build like stacks of file cabinets that go to the moon.
Yeah, I mean, this is still a relevant problem. There was a hack in the US 5 years ago now. It was an Experian credit reporting database. And it turned out to be sort of brilliant from the point of view of the people who did it. Intelligence service hacked that, got a US security clearance database, and then you have the intersection of people with access to sensitive data and debt, right? And so this sort of systems are a problem. And again, you can coach these kind of privacy things as issues that governments care about.
Wait, sorry. So we wanted to talk about World War III resilient tech.
Yeah.
So basically we're saying what's not resilient is centralized databases.
These are still like relevant examples even now.
So scale matters, I think, to a large extent. Like something will always be centralized at some level of scale, right? Like, and we're never going to get to like everyone is going to run everything themselves because at that point you're losing the ability to fundamentally coordinate. I think it becomes more the question like, is it a good idea that there's a central government database in the US that like contains everyone's information? That seems like the wrong kind of scale to aggregate this kind of data, whereas like a local community, local city, 30,000 people, that may make a lot of sense to aggregate data here because you want to allow lots of like interactivity at that kind of scale, right? So I think it's not about we shouldn't have any data. It's more like at what kind of scales do we collect data, and like how can you sort of go across these scales because they all live in the same system, for example.
Well, the bigger issue is maintaining data for long periods of time. If you have it, because if you're a bar or something that's checking to see if somebody's over 18 or 21 to come in, that's maybe look at the ID, don't retain any data. What they do now in a lot of places in the US is they run it through a machine that scans the ID, builds it into a marketing database so they can then do marketing with it, and then retains a list of all the people
I've
that
never
have
been scanned at a. Do they do that now?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's another. I mean, it's an example of a pervasive point in our society where like the selling point of scale, right, is efficiency, and selling point is centralization. You can just do things much more effectively instead of having to trust, like your local municipality run by, bureaucrats who can barely turn a computer on to have to manage the servers and technology stacks. You just have one centralized entity that handles it all. Great, but then there's just horrifically perverse incentives because you have to trust the entity that's holding all your data to act with some kind according to your interests. and why will they do that if they can profit from not doing that? Like, for example, selling your information onto marketing agencies. And so, I think this sets out like this. This is it's an effect that like we're all widely aware of. Like no one, like everyone's aware of data monetization. No one likes it, but I think that it's often not discussed very very openly when talking about this trade-off space between like decentralization and scalability, where the more decentralized things are, the harder it is for unaligned actors to use data against the interests of the user, whether that is a marketing company today or if it's some totalitarian state desiring legibility over its citizens in World War III.
So since I work in crypto insurance, I see a lot of the cyber insurance world, and the cyber insurance world, it has a lot of serious problems. It was created about 20 years ago, and some people thought it was going to fix the industry. It turned out it kind of hasn't, and it's made some things worse. The issue there is there's no real liability if you're Equifax and you get hacked and everybody gets your data. Their penalty was some small fines and then credit monitoring services for people. That's completely useless. So unless there's real liability for people, like if you crash a plane that has a bunch of passengers on it, you're going to face financial liability as well as consumer won't fly on that aircraft and things like that. So there's real liability there. You can then build insurance against it. You can then build policies, regulations, everything else around it. As long as we've capped the liability of these things at some de minimis level of, like, I think in bulk it's like less than $1 for credit monitoring service for people. There's no ability to prevent that kind of thing from happening. People need to think of having this data around as like toxic waste and a liability and not want to collect it in the first place and be actively pushing back against regulations that require them to collect it. Because the other problem here is we have some organizations that collect data just because they want to use it maybe for future marketing stuff. Other organizations, because of KYC, AML, everything else, are required to collect it. If you're buying some random NFT from a website, you don't really have much exposure to risk there, but if they're required to KYC you in order to do that transaction, then they have your KYC data, which is actually valuable to you, and some random NFT website is probably not going to take care of it to the same degree that you would like it to be taken care of.
And interesting enough, I think the random NFT website does not want that data.
Yeah.
It's like who the fuck wants, I think no bank in the world wants to do KYC. It is like the single most toxic process possible.
So I think this is talking around, there are two reasons why data gets collected. One is people who want to monetize it, but the other one is because if everything's transparent, the only way you can get trust is to take the data. And one of the interesting advantages of programmable privacy combined with the blockchain is the hope that you can keep some of your data either yourself or at a local thing, and then program statements about it. And you can start to get away from positions where you have to collect everything as a functional reality, right? There's a second point of how you get the rules and regulations to follow to it. But right now, you need those abilities first.
Okay,
Yeah,
I would like to bring us back to World War III. Did you want to?
Just one tiny thing. I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think one of the really powerful things about the technology that's being developed in this space is that I was talking previously about like this trade-off between decentralization and scalability, and what you're talking about is like we're not trying to move the needle there, really. What we're trying to do is just use technology to mean that you don't have to sacrifice so much to centralization in order to scale products and services to provide the same conveniences we expect in our daily lives.
All right, cool. Like I said, I'm obsessed about World War II, so I would like to come back to World War III. Okay, so a little bit more concretely, narrative role play. Let's brainstorm some of the tools we actually need, not the tools that don't work. Okay, so a few of us, live in a city. So Ameen's the hairdresser, and Adrian's the fashion maker, and then the rest of us were just normal people. So what do we need to communicate, organize, and transact? And when you talk about these things, you always need to think about threat models. So let's say the threat model is one or all of these. We can't trust our ISP. We can't trust our hardware. Encryption is illegal if the government doesn't have a backdoor. Strangers and drones may have access temporarily to our devices. We're not sure if the enemy has, or whoever our enemy is.
So we're in occupied territory. I just want to understand the setup, right?
So the way I was thinking about it is it can be pre or post. Because, for example, in a world like 1984, all of that happened within their own country. It was just kind of this paranoia around who's helping the enemy or who's not like bought in enough, so that everybody's swimming in the same direction. So I think it can be on both
This sounds like you're
sides.
describing like Iran today.
Sadly.
You don't need to look that far.
Sadly,
the
yes.
apps on their phone are backdoored, but like their food app and their transport app is like controlled by the spy agencies, so they know what other apps you have on your phone.
Yeah.
All of the internet communications messaging is monitored. Everybody has to use a VPN. The VPN is basically whack-a-mole. You have to use a new endpoint, or sometimes they cut off the whole internet. If you protest without a hijab, they'll zero your bank account if they feel like it. All of those things just apply. It feels more like a
Sadly,
Civil
yeah.
War thing, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is. I think these are sort of. To me, the distinction becomes very quickly like: do you trust your local governance system, or is it more like a civil war scenario where it's you against the government? Because I think when I think about sort of World War III, you want to be resilient for not against like your own local government, if you still trust your local government. And like I'm saying this from perspective of I really fundamentally trust the Zouk government. I love Switzerland, so like.
I think for the sake of like just clarity, let's just assume it's global and local government is still on your side, but they may still spy on you.
Yeah, let's roll with this because it's an interesting thought experiment. Particularly like if you can't trust your hardware, I do think you're kind of turbo. Like, pardon my French, you're turbo fucked.
Yeah.
Because if you can't sign digital signatures without leaking a private key, I don't really think any of the technologies we're developing are going to be that useful.
So I would say you need to be indistinguishable from other people. Like, assume they have finite resources to go after you. They're not universally able to go after every single person putting a FSB agent sitting next to you the whole time. So you just need to not distinguish yourself from other people that are. You don't need to run faster than the bear. You need to run faster than the friend that you don't really like too much that's also running from the bear. So as long as your activity doesn't draw enough attention, you're probably okay. If you have a bunch of machines, let's say you've got a Mac, an iPhone, an Android device, and a gaming console or something, you could probably construct some system where you don't trust any one of them all that much, but collectively they were probably not all hacked all at the same time, and also where they're stateless, so they're running some binary and you're inputting a memory key so that you're not leaving state on the machine. So there's probably ways you could build a reasonable system that isn't completely doomed 100%, but you would be accepting risk. But it's a war, you're accepting risk. And also, it also depends on your threat model. If you're living in an occupied territory or in a war zone, or you don't trust your local government and you're going to the local hairdresser and things like that, they probably don't care about that. So a lot of transactions don't matter. So you don't necessarily need to be 100% opaque from all things they're monitoring. You just need to be not really super attractive.
Yeah. There's this particular problem amongst technologists, and I was guilty of this earlier in my career, where we think of it's either binary, either you're fine or it's 1984 and everything you're doing is screwed. But actually, it's more of an outrunning the bear. Even with places like Iran, where there's serious technical resources, it's not like every single person is completely surveilled. It's you need to not stick out. You need to be careful which apps you use. And so, for example, you can use Signal to a degree. You might be more worried about like somebody in your Signal group being an informant. Right, it might be more important rather than worrying about malware on your phone to worry about like some degree of pseudo-anonymity inside groups and how do you authenticate who you're working with, right? These are all kinds of classic things people go like, how do you run every system for example.
The other thing I think in terms of like pure technological stuff, you'd want to rely somewhat on like shortwave radio.
Shortwave radio.
Yeah, like encrypted shortwave radio, just because you can do information distribution. Where you can pinpoint the sender, but it's like it's a receive all kind of thing where you cannot pinpoint who's actually receiving the comms. And the other thing is it's super low tech. Like this does not require like tons of like technical expertise. Radios like used to be everywhere. So like you want to be falling back to like more resilient forms of communication that are harder to track.
So we're at a crypto conference. So let's throw out words like RPC nodes, IPFS for news, or ENS for our collaboration website or something. Can we talk about some of those?
Done.
How do you guys feel about putting the nuclear codes on the blockchain? Like put it up to a DAO vote, like we all flip a...
That'd be interesting.
Yeah. But in general, I think the idea of using broadcast mechanisms to coordinate, it makes a lot of sense. All of those systems are built on top of inherently like peer-to-peer or client-server kind of things that would be traceable. If you were to build something that was a message pool, sort of like, I don't know, the old remailers on Usenet or things like that, or radio or any sort of system. Also, in the World War II analogy, you do have states that were neutral, that were safe places to meet and do transactions. In the World War III world, Switzerland probably is going to be okay. Like if I were stuck in, if I had to pick a priori a country that would be okay, Switzerland would be pretty high on the list of countries, not guaranteed. So if I had infrastructure that was in Switzerland and I could then communicate with it through broadcast and it could do all sorts of trustworthy local stuff and then communicate back to me, that would be great.
Yeah, but
So on the broadcasting, like why radio waves are actually great is also because jamming them jamming is obvious. In the sense like you can tap fiber and this is like a non-obvious behavior, or you can block fiber connection or like direct like the internet connections. It is very obvious to the rest of the sort of society if you jam broadly the radio spectrum.
I have an idiot question. Can you do blockchain transactions on radio waves?
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, but the
Explain.
Wi-Fi is radio waves.
I mean, like
packet radar, GPRS.
FM radio, AM radio is just like a different spectrum on the radio spectrum.
But there's a larger problem with all of this.
We had, at some point, there was an interesting idea in the early proof of stake days on, so like how do you detect forks in proof of stake blockchains if you're in an environment where they censor the internet. And so one idea was you can do like skywave AM broadcasts of block hashes, so at least you can detect if your local validator is on a fork. I mean, it's a fun concept. If you ever want to build it, it's cool.
That's incredible.
But
There's also a blockchain satellite right now, like a Bitcoin satellite. So
That's Bitcoin satellite. Can you
there's
say
a
more about that?
problem with all of this, though, which is if you're in this scenario where the government's coming after you or as foreign government's coming after you, what you said, you have to not stand out. If you're the only person using this tech, or it's just you and your privacy nerds on this island, doesn't matter. Your anonymity set is, slightly better than Monero Ring CT, but not very good.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. But let's kind of like I'd like to run with that and just see what you could get with the kind of technology we're building. So I'm going to just shill Aztec for a little bit, or at least the technology behind it. Where with a network like Aztec, because of like the massive leaps and bounds that have happened in ZK over the last few years. If you send an Aztec transaction, you have a zero-knowledge proof of correctness and a bunch of encrypted state transitions. And that's basically it. Or at least you can construct it so that's all that you do. So you're saying, I'm not going to tell you who I am or what I'm transacting or what smart contract I'm calling, but I can prove to you that the smart contracts I'm calling do exist and I'm following their rules, and here are the state updates that come from that. And so obviously, if someone can see that transaction coming out of your IP address, you've got a problem. If you're using sneaky subversive chain on your island and no one else is using sneaky subversive chain, maybe with mixed nets, things like that, or using encrypted proxies. If you can get your transaction to some aligned person in a neutral country, maybe that could be plausible. But the network level privacy, I think, is a lot harder than the blockchain level privacy. Because once your transaction has actually reached that blockchain network, you can't extract anything useful or interesting out of it if you're spying on the user.
I mean, knowing there's all the secret stuff that like Chainalysis does, where they look at which node gets transactions first and things like that, and have a global. I guess this isn't all that secret. They maintain databases of all of which nodes get stuff first and traces and everything else, and use that to approximately geolocate people and also look at versioning on clients. So there's a whole lot of stuff that you can do that sort of breaks that nice abstraction of it's a blockchain, but I generally agree. A network level anonymity is a much harder problem.
Is NIM a solution for this?
It is a network transport layer, but if you were the only user using NIM, that stands out even more than using Bitcoin. So,
and I think like this is more the civil war where you have to like protect, like, or you're trying to like overthrow your local government. It's like I think as soon as you're in this position, transacting on any privacy preserving system is just going to become very risky because probably most people around you won't do it. Right, like this requires large-scale adoption. So like sort of all finance currently runs on sort of like a privacy-preserving blockchain. Because if you're like the only 3 people in town that keep sending money on this privacy-preserving thing, it's not going to be that difficult to figure out that maybe we should figure out look specifically at these 3 dudes and see what they're up to.
If you change the parameters of the thought experiment, though, I think you can get something interesting, right? Because imagine like this network is widely used, but maybe by an adversary state, or maybe by like some other entity, some polity that you're not a part of. So there are lots of transactions. There's traffic on this network. Then like the mere problem is basically getting your transaction to their network without people seeing it came from you. Where possibly depending if the transaction is particularly high value, if you're trying to do some some shenanigans, if you're in an occupied territory, you could just use basic. Fall back to the most basic human element, right? You put your transaction on a memory stick, and you get a human runner, a courier to get it over into the territory where this network is commonly used, and then send your transaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need 2 things. One, you need legitimate people legitimately using it. And then 2, the thing needs to actually be decentralized. All of this is moot if it's a roll-up one on run server and that gets extra data or gets taken down, right? So these are also problems, or you can exclude transactions from it.
I mean,
I would also say, like, I'm very skeptical on the thought experiment that there's a global consensus that's being formed. Like in an actual hot World War III scenario, there's not going to be a global consensus between like a bunch of nodes in China and a bunch of nodes in Europe and a bunch of nodes in North America, right? So like, I think we'll have to like be very specific on like what specific network are you interacting with, because they're not going to be these global systems anymore.
Yeah, in the World War III scenario, you would presumably be an American living in an area controlled by China, and you would then be talking to the American network. The American network would be very happy with you, and you just need to somehow get connected to it. And the same thing would apply to China, the same thing would apply to Russia. So you would have some islands that are trustworthy. Also, if you look at how organizations in denied areas or non-permissive environments work today, it's not usually individuals, it's a group of people. So you have you have your operational people, and then you have other people that are like the local barber, the local whatever, who are tolerated by the local people because they do some local stuff, and they happen to also work with resistance groups and can funnel transactions in and out of their normal flow. So it's not as if your high target people are going to be the ones doing all the transactions.
Speaking of the local barber, Ameen, is this a good time to share some of the things you've been doing, the tool that you've been...
Yeah, sure. So this is a conversation relevant to probably both the projects I've been recently working on. One is the privacy pool stuff, which is about, compliance, or, when you're at war, you don't want your enemies to necessarily be depositing their funds in your systems, or withdrawing funds from your systems, or getting privacy from your citizens, or giving privacy to your citizens. And so you might want to figure out ways of identifying their money. So the privacy pools project is about building lists based on monitoring on the blockchain, people's transaction patterns. Like, for example, if you deposit into the privacy pools and then you turn around and send all your money to Hamas, they'll probably not add you or then go on and remove you. That's something that, for example, Israel would be interested in. Or if you're in Ukraine, you don't want to necessarily have the Russians trying to deposit into your systems. So I think when it comes to war, being able to exclude people from your community becomes more important as a goal. That's not something we're used to, right? We like the word permissionlessness. We like the word decentralized. But if we're talking about self-sovereignty, I would make the argument that freedom of association implies freedom of dissociation, which means if you force me to associate with some of the people in order to get privacy or access to the financial system, then maybe that's not what I want. Maybe I also want to be able to have my community, and within my community, have the sovereignty to say I don't want to, transact alongside some other people that are potentially using the system. The second thing that it's relevant to is I was in Ukraine last week, met up with some very talented developers from Rarimo, who built this thing called Freedom Tool to troll the Russian government by helping the Russian opposition hold like parallel elections, which is pretty funny. They say Putin's illegitimate, and the way it works is it uses passport scanning. So you scan the passport, and then it verifies that there's a valid signature on the passport, basically hijacks.
Just to be clear, RFID scanning, not like photo scanning, right?
Photo scans your passport, and then an NFC chip.
No, it's the signed. It's the signed NFT data.
Yeah.
It's when you tap your passport to your phone, right? And it signs it.
It also
validates
looks
then an NFC signature.
We'll come back to this. But anyway, long story short, you're not actually revealing any of your passport data because it's able to generate the zero-knowledge proof of who you are and where you're from, where your passport's from, and that it's a valid passport and that you're above 18 and so forth without revealing any of your data, which is pretty cool, pretty novel. It also happened to work for Iranian passports. And so we decided to use it, made a thing called Iranians Vote. We held our own little, parallel election where Iranians could vote no confidence in the Islamic Republic or its recent election, which was last week. And
Were the numbers 100% in both cases?
where the what?
Like, the parallel.
Oh, yeah. Well, we only allowed you to vote one way. So it wasn't like
One of those elections.
It was more of like a protest, than an election. But it proved how zero knowledge proofs work to a lot of people. A lot of Iranians come up to us afterwards. They're like, "What are you doing with our data?" We're like, "It's not leaving the device." But like, "Where are you uploading it?" We're not uploading it. It takes some time to educate people about that. You can just get access to voting with the proof, and you're not actually revealing any of the data. But for example, let's say one of the Iranian developers we talked to got excited about this. He's like, we want to build a version on top of this. We want to make some way of getting information from Iranians. Let's call it a survey app, and then we can pay people to do the surveys. But then we're like, wait, how do we not get trolled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps because they're going to try and like spam the system with like their names? So they're like, all right, well, first of all, we could actually censor people at the level of their passport name. So we could go to the OFAC list and then be like, here are the list of names we want to exclude. And then you can, in the zero knowledge proof, be like, here's a proof that I have a valid passport and I am none of these names. And you can do that too. And, if your name happens to be Ali Khamenei, sorry, it's not going to work. But for everybody else, it'll probably work out. And so something like that, where we generate better and better lists of the people that we're trying to exclude, will probably be even more useful.
Super relevant. Thanks, Barbara. Ian, would you like to tell us a little bit more about like this idea of identity, ZK identities?
Right. So this is an idea of doing ZK identities dating back at least to some papers we wrote in 2014, right before Zcash. Where you can do anonymous credentials on a blockchain. You have a credential and you prove something about it. And so last year, my research group at Maryland wrote this paper that did exactly the same passport trick, where you can take a passport, scan it, put it on a blockchain, commitment to it, nobody else can see it. And then you can later prove things about who you are, that you're over 18, that you're over 21, or more complicated things about how long you've had the account, or potentially what your reputation is. And so the really interesting bit about this is once you have programmable privacy platforms like Aleo or Aztec, you can write prototypes of this very quickly. So Aleo went and built ZPass, which is a system that does this. And this means you can do custom ideas that you have without having to employ 3 or 4 PhDs who are sort of persnickety and kind of have arguments of what they want to use and what kind of curves. No, you can just go use like Leo or Noir or something and write whatever you want with these kind of identity things. And I think this is important because the applications aren't going to come from the people doing the research. They aren't going to come from the people building the platforms. They're going to come from people who decide, like, say, they want to troll the Iranian Islamic Republican Guard Corps, or whatever it is.
Speaking of World War III, could you do a survey of what bridges and aircraft and things like that look in an area attested by people who are shown from the area and then blacklisted or not?
I suppose you could. This is being live streamed. I don't know if I really want to comment. I'm not sure whose bridges you're talking about. If it's like bridges into Crimea, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also, you wouldn't be able to tell. You'd be able to tell. Yeah, they're local. You wouldn't be able to tell if they're actually on your side.
But you'd be able to blacklist people if they reported bad.
If you could figure it out.
So this is a very good point because the passports are not going to be enough. You really, going to have to start programming like reputation systems where you bootstrap something off of whatever it is that's Sybil resistant.
Yeah, but it's
not enough, right? In particular, like one of the problems is the government can print passports. And so that's precisely why you get this funny sounding thing that's legitimate of like you can only vote one way. Because the yes votes are definitely going to be the government. So
Like-
it's just how many no votes are there.
Yeah.
I think especially with identity, I think passports are a very good bootstrapping mechanism.
But they're not enough.
But they're not enough, right? Because like when you think about passports are like this weird abstraction that sort of after World War I we invented out of nowhere. And they don't actually represent like identity really well. What represents identity way better is you actually social graph in your local community. Like my grandparents' friends are probably better at testing to like me as a human than any passport ever can, right? Because they sort of saw the development from like 0 to 6 or something like this, right? So like I think, but I agree like decentralized identity is very difficult, but passports are going to be the thing to bootstrap, and I think we can just like do smart things where like if all of a sudden we see 1 billion American passports, we can probably figure out that not all of them are real.
Yeah,
This
you
is
can,
also kind of the airdrop problem.
yeah, it's exactly the airdrop problem. You can use things like transaction volume. If a history of transacting with legitimate parties that don't do wash trading, so this is kind of hard, you can start getting other indications that someone is not a Sybil. You can do things like you have an email history or a posting history. And because it's all CK, you're not revealing all of this to the blockchain. So things like that you can play with. And that's the thing you do on Aztec or Aleo or Polygon Maiden, whoever was showing themselves in the Q&A earlier.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? Like the passports are the literal tip of the iceberg. They're the first step, right? Where like we finally got these programmable ZK environments, and then we're like, wow, hey, passports, they're easy to do. Let's do those. But like this more kind of this concept of a more holistic identity is something that I'm extremely excited about because it goes far beyond passports. Like anything with to start with. The low-hanging fruit is anything with a chip that you can NFC scan. So you have passports, you have driving licenses, you have e-identities, you have bank cards, right? If you can prove you've got a bank card if you have a bank account in a certain country, like that is some kind of attestation. And then you have things that you can use ZK to create a bridge between Web 2 and Web 3, where you have things like TLS Notary. I wish we had more than TLS Notary, but TLS is a shitty protocol, wasn't future-proofed. But where you can do things like prove, oh, I have a Twitter account, I have a Google account, I have over 100 followers. I've had this account since 2012. I have a UK bank account, I have a UK passport. Okay, you've got some pretty strong confidence. I am a person and not a bot. And this kind of like, I reckon what's going to happen is you're going to have these kind of holistic identity solutions where you, just like you have a credit score, you can have an identity score where like the more like attestations and proofs you can get about who you are, the stronger, the more confidence the network will have that they're dealing with a human being and not a Sybil or a bot.
I'd like to actually talk about something that's adjacent to this, provable, like I am a human idea. So we're talking about one passport. We each only have one. I mean, you could have from multiple countries. From each country, you only have one passport. The thing that I've been thinking about a bit has been multiple identities, which gives you plausible deniability. And it constantly pains me that on Signal and all of their apps, you basically can only sign on to one account. Whereas, apps like Notion and Slack, you use this concept of, oh, for my work one or my project one, I have one login and then other logins for my, other facets of my life. I wonder in your own products and companies, how do you think about this to give people the ability to like present themselves differently to different circles?
So I think the general point is you can have an identity and a score and a history of what you do, but you can present as many different pseudonyms and accounts as you want. And this is important because the typical reason why it's hard to have accounts on the current internet is because you need what's called Sybil resistance to protect from bots and stuff. So you have to prove you possess a phone number or an email address, and these are all linkable. But if you have one identity and some way of attesting, I have this reputation, I'm not going to tell you who I am or what it is, you can make as many different personas as you want, and they're completely unlinkable. And so that is where this whole space should be going.
On top of that, like, you can also do that whilst preserving Sybil resistance, right? Because I can have two accounts, right? I can have like one identity that's linked to two accounts. So I could be Zach and I could be DGen Trader 1234. But you can still validate, like you can still have applications and protocols on these networks that can validate if Zach has interacted, then DJ1234 can't interact, like on a vote or something like that. If that capability is decided, it can be absolutely programmed in. Yeah, I agree completely.
I'm always terrified of everyone that keeps telling me about like a single identity system, I think what you always want is the ability to completely start from scratch and like have the ability
Yes.
to sort of like to switch to a competing system. I think this is very important. Like there should not be a single global identity standard because this sounds to me terrifying. Because even the most globally decentralized thing is a single centralized failure point in my view. And so you want to have the ability to be able to go, fine, I'm currently on this system, and like let me completely start from scratch with a new identity.
So this is a very good point, and actually it's worse than it's a single point of failure. You can get cryptography correct, you can do formal verification. If you put all your eggs in one basket, it's not good, but you can get around it. The bigger thing is the rules can change, right? You can have a privacy-preserving system. A lot of people are now talking about identity in the browser, right? And you have a privacy-preserving way to prove you're over 18 because some states in the US are starting to ban access to adult content, for example. And then the rules can change, say, oh, you had that privacy thing, but now that you have your credential in there, we're going to turn off the privacy. And then you've got a problem. And so this is one of these things where techno-optimism and just building a solution, even the ones that Zach and I have been describing, isn't enough. And you need to be very, very careful about that.
Techno-pessimism. Build many different ways to escape the system.
All right, so speaking of pessimism, I want to move on to maybe our last topic of the day, which is we've tried all of these things before. Ryan has been, cypherpunk since the 90s. And, it's like cycles of, we're going to have distributed systems. Everybody's going to run their own servers. Hasn't happened and isn't likely to happen. So my question is, why have we failed? And what do we need to do differently this time?
I don't think we failed. I mean, I think there have been clear cycles. The current cycle we're in is probably coming to an end. Like the current cycle is like this Pax Americana cycle, right? Where we're all very happy to checkpoint into global US security. Most of our financial, most of our internet infrastructure is built around this idea. Like none of these systems are designed to like survive in a multipolar world order. And I think, except the internet actually, the internet may be okay, like local network connectivity may be okay, but like I think this is why we're currently in the cycle and like we were at the peak where everyone is like, well, we all use these centralized systems. No one runs their own software anymore. No one runs their own hardware anymore. But this is because we reached the peak of the Pax Americana cycle. And now as we're heading sort of into the next cycle where the world is going to become more unstable, it's probably going to revert back to the mean on like people are going to start running their own infrastructure again. And I think they'll have to.
I think we're probably not going to see end users running their own stuff directly in almost all cases. We might in very exceptional cases, but we are going to see federated systems as opposed to centralized systems. So I would say a better example is probably like Mastodon versus X or Twitter or something like that. Hasn't been super successful, but systems like that are designed for just federation from day one. If you were to have something like Signal and a federated version of Signal, like forget the name of the other one, but Simplex, yeah. There are a bunch of these applications now that are federated. They just you give up a lot in order to be federated versus centralized, and people are unwilling to give that up if they don't have to, but they may have to.
And to be clear, when I'm never saying that I think individuals are going to run, like every individual, my parents are not going to run their own home data center, right? It's more like if you're in this room, you're probably in charge for your local community to maintain network connectivity. Like you are going to have to run the local data center for your community, right? Like this is more, it's not that every individual has to do this, it's more like you have to have someone in your local trust graph that provides this kind of like technological services rather than relying on the like 3 centralized servers somewhere across the ocean. I'm
skeptical that's going to happen unless World War III starts, to be honest. I mean, because the problem is always there's so much inertia to those kinds of localized systems. I hope you're right, but
no, I hope I'm wrong.
But
because this implies World War III.
Can I say two points, hopefully briefly? One of them is that did we fail? I mean, I'm guilty of this. Like when I'm giving talks, I like to say the original cypherpunk ambition failed. It's more complicated than that. I think certainly the original aspirations. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the original aspirations weren't really achieved, right? Like the web got corrupted quite quickly to these like hyper-centralized content providers and social media companies. But also, if you think about the way the world is now versus where it was before the internet, it is a much more liberated place where individuals have a lot more agency. And I think the perfect example of this is the rise of right-wing populism and Donald Trump. Right? Like why was there such a groundswell of support for those kinds of populist candidates and the kind of the backlash from, I would say, like almost like an intellectual backlash, right, from maybe more educated people, it's because what happened was an enormous number of people started to participate in political systems that previously didn't have a voice. People who, like via communicating on social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, people were being able to share ideas and like create like mimetic like narratives, where before these kinds of people they just wouldn't be part of the conversation because they weren't let in with more established traditional media. And this might be constrained. I think that's a good thing. I think this, hopefully, I mean, I'm not American, so you know, this is your problem, it's not my problem. But that this is a growing pain. This is a growing pain of like opening up political participation to an enormous swath of people that were previously excluded, and that was because of the internet and the Web 1 revolution. So it partially succeeded.
Don't think that was the cypherpunk ethos, right? I don't think it wasn't Mastodon that did that. It was Twitter. It was the internet. And so you said like what went wrong. I think the largest thing we've seen, particularly for privacy-preserving tech in cryptocurrency, but more largely, is it's been a bit of an echo chamber. You've had a huge amount of sort of ego and martyrdom sort of people running it, and no OODA loop. Nobody will react and look at what they actually need to get it done, think about what they did wrong, and change it, right? And that makes sense if you think about what it takes to launch one of these things and get it up and running, because it's scary as hell, and you are running legitimate risks of going to jail. But you need to be able to adapt and figure out when, oh, we tried this, we're not getting market traction, we're not getting adoption, we're not getting users, we need to add something.
Yeah, the main issue is it's very difficult to build anything because there isn't a model where somebody builds one layer of the stack and it works really well, there's a great abstraction, then people can build stuff on top of it. You end up, in a lot of cases, reinventing everything every single time, or large sections of the stack. So the minimum size for doing something is very large compared to building any other kind of application. So it's much harder to innovate.
We're trying to solve that.
I want to talk about America for a second. First of all, you would all be better off if Pax Americana was continuing going. Like, you should pray to get annexed by America. Forget NATO. That's just the beginning. Second of all, America, and I say this while one of my friends is facing prison. He will go on trial on September 23rd, Roman Storm, who helped, one of the developers of Tornado Cash. We have the Samurai Wallet cases now. America certainly is getting things wrong. And the history of the cypherpunk movement and cryptography in America actually still gives me hope that America will eventually get things right. Right. So before, I told the story about Alan Turing and how there was a professor and how he taught cryptography in class and he was arrested for exporting munitions. But the way the story ends is cryptography is mandated by the government on all government websites, for example. Right. Before they tried to ban it, and now they mandate it. And I'm hoping that private money goes the same way for the reasons that Adrian brings up. It's a defense thing, right? Who on earth would think it's reasonable to send everybody's financial information in plain text on the internet? But that's what we're doing. Every router, every ISP, everywhere, every hop along the way gets all of that information. And the government tried to mandate their Clipper chip, this backdoored system of encryption that only they could use, and hackers broke it in a week. And after they broke it, the government basically gave up and said, fine, you win. We'll give people access to encryption and let them, and mandate it even for our own sites. And so, while it does look like we're getting things wrong right now, which we are, I'm hoping that in the future, the government goes and says, you know what, this private money stuff is really important. Our banks keep getting hacked by China. We don't want everybody's personal
Another
financial
challenge,
information
though,
to
is
be
the IRS. It's not just security; it's the IRS, right? And
The four horsemen of the apocalypse: taxes, child porn, terrorism, and money.
What's the IRS?
okay, we have 1 minute 30 seconds. Do we have time for many questions? All right. Yeah. Do you want to?
I have a quite practical one. So, by different estimates of intelligence agencies in Europe, NATO gonna encounter physical warfare with Russia, and US is estimating something like 2029 with China. So what would be your personal one tool that you would use if you happen to be in this scenario in less than 6 years?
Wow.
and why?
Good question.
More than any software tool, having a network of people that you trust and work with and are friends with that you can rely on.
Your local community is all that matters. Like the people that live next to you are your biggest help or your biggest threat. Like if you live in New York, I probably wouldn't bet on that, your local community coming through. Like if you live in a small town where you've lived for the last 15 years, you're probably in a much better space.
As the local barber, I think I would try to find figure out who Ryan's friends are and hang out with them probably as our local warlord.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if there's a hot war, I think everyone's needs become much more closer to home. You know, it's not really about technology at that point, in my view.
I think that's roughly right. I will say, depending on how many surveillance cameras you have around, it may be safer to message your friends over something like Signal than it is to meet up with them. So it's still the network, but you may not be able to do it in MeetSpace because MeetSpace may be occupied.
I would also just default disappearing messages because they can go
Yes.
way back.
That is the default everyone should have. You can go into Signal and set it as a default. You can set it to like 4 weeks if you want. But you shouldn't have the norm of keeping around all your messages. It just sets you up for problems when those kind of things
Especially on the device you carry around with you at all time that can be unlocked with your face or your fingerprint non-testimonially.
And this isn't just a problem for governments. Like if you have an abusive ex-girlfriend or boyfriend and they go through your phone, this has happened to friends
That's
of
why
mine.
we need
It's a real problem.
plausible deniability, right? Like somebody says, unlock your Signal, unlock the other account, like your ledgers. Thank you. Maybe one more?
Hey, great presentation, great panel. I'm glad that these topics actually covered on like crypto conferences, and I want to bring up like maybe a moral question about for cryptographers in general. I will reference like work by Philip Rogue, called "The Moral Character of Cryptographic Works," and also a presentation by Jeremy Hammond this year at CCC, the Chaos Computer Camp, and they both kind of like converge on this idea that like there are a lot of like white hat hacker types that like could be the next node, but they aren't. And the question is like, do you think there's a lack of moral direction in like crypto community and like people who are working on enhancing like cryptography and like privacy enhancing technologies, because just in a way to like enhance their academic career or like work for business, and like what do you think are good strategies to bring this topic of like, you know, moral obligation of a person who have like causal efficacy over the world in like really strange way to actually make a change, because I personally see there's lack of that conversation.
All right, I guess I'll give a spicy take. You shouldn't have let the roll-up people rebrand ZK as roll-ups. I don't mind about changing definitions. We changed crypto from cryptography to cryptocurrency. But now we have people going, oh, but those are private, when they're manifestly not. And that makes it substantially harder to actually build privacy-preserving protocols. And yeah, just don't let that kind of thing happen. Be aware that this is Twitter for your bank account, and handing your data to a server to prove it doesn't solve that problem.
My problem with the moral argument is that nobody thinks they are evil. They always think they're doing things for good purposes. So you might have somebody trying to exclude people because they're fighting a war against them, and you might have other people trying to track down other people because they're fighting a war against them, and you might be one of those people. So, yeah.
From my perspective, I think don't make it against local, like make it a positive thing, like privacy for national defense or privacy for local communities. So that, like, because like people want to like be associated with something positive, and like I think especially framing a lot of the privacy preserving tech and cryptography around like a positive impact you can have on your local community is like really helpful, rather than like, oh, I'm against the government, like we're here to like build against the government. Like most people can't really associate with this.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, yeah, a lot of the things that we thought were moral were like maybe not. And so like, I think we've all matured a little bit, right? Like in working in the space. For example, the best company in crypto right now is Tether. Like what moral value does Tether have? The largest miners of Bitcoin in Iran is the IRGC itself, right? Is this Pooh's bags we want to pump? You know, the largest individual potentially user of Tornado Cash was, you know, illicit. Is that what we want, you know, for our systems? Maybe not. Maybe we should think about that. It's not 2017 anymore. You know, we have to acknowledge the enemies that are at the gates and build our systems to deal with the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I fully heard your question, but was it around asking like whether like we should be speaking more about moral imperatives for like cryptographers and white hat hackers to act morally? And if it is, then I don't think that's an important narrative at all, because if you have a system that relies on people to be good actors for that system to survive, that system is not going to survive. That's just the unfortunate reality we live in. Like, for example, like maybe this isn't an example, but you know, okay, so I have my own biases, right? Because I'm a little bit of an outsider to the cryptographic community. You know, I was self-taught, mentored by amazing people. But like the paper that I co-published, the two ones that kind of had an impact, like Plonk and Pluckup, you know, like we wrote those papers to basically like to almost like to not conform to the standards that existing academic communities required. Like they're not published in any journals, right? No peer-reviewed journal will take Plonk because it doesn't speak the right lingo. Like what lingo does it speak? If you read the paper, there's a section where we call it the Unrolled Protocol, where I wrote basically like a recipe for, okay, if you're an engineer and you want to build this thing, here's what you do. Now, this paper is not easy to read because standards were so much lower back in 2019 than they are today, but it was a lot easier to read than anything else out there, in my opinion. I think there's an axis here between like almost like sacredness and profanity, right? Where the cryptographic community and the white hat community can very much act like a self-appointed guardians to the knowledge that they hold, and act like an elite, where you have to follow their rules, and you have to basically be like them in order for them to access their secrets. You know, like, who has tried to read a cryptography paper? They're fucking miserable. You know, like, they're shit. As in, like, okay, if you want to formally prove a concept, great. They do the job. If you want to communicate an idea to someone, you know, it is the most like brain-dead way of communicating information you could think of. Sorry if I'm offending people here. I think it's shit. Like I think one of my mandates and missions is basically to break apart the need for cryptographers to be like leading this like the bleeding edge of the technologies that we're building, to create abstraction layers and tooling that means that people who don't have those kind of extraordinarily like rarefied and high level skills, like people without those skills, they can make major contributions, and broadening access so that you have a much larger pool of participants, and therefore hopefully you'll have a much larger pool of people who will act like towards good and humane ends. Okay, that's my view.
I think the red light has been flashing for a while. So I think this is a good time to end. Thank you all very much for all these spicy takes. I hope you guys had fun.